Thanks for joining us this afternoon for what I think will be a fantastic discussion on reinvesting in America's infrastructure and how to pay for it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ben Ritz, and I'm the director of the Progressive Policy Institute's Center for Funding America's Future. Our mission is to develop radically pragmatic policy proposals for strengthening public investments in the foundation of our economy, modernizing federal health and retirement programs to reflect an aging society, and transforming our tax code to reward work over wealth. You can learn more about PPI by visiting progressivepolicy.org. We have a terrific panel today, but before we begin, we have some opening remarks from Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Senator Manchin was sworn into the United States Senate on November 15th, 2010 to fill the seat left vacant by the late Senator Robert Byrd and has been reelected twice since then. Senator Manchin currently serves as the chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and also serves on the Senate Committee on Appropriations, the Senate Committee on Armed Services, and the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. Before coming to the U.S. Senate, Senator Manchin served as governor of West Virginia for 6 years. From his days as Senator Manchin has always been committed to his philosophy of retail government. In other words, connecting with all of his constituents and making service to them his top priority. As a senator, Joe Manchin is committed to bringing the same spirit of bipartisanship to Washington. As he has done throughout his life, he remains committed to working with Republicans and Democrats to find common sense solutions to the problems our country faces and is working hard to usher in a new bipartisan spirit in the Senate and Congress. As many of you know, Senator Manchin spearheaded the bipartisan COVID relief compromise at the end of the last Congress and provided the crucial 50th vote for President Biden's American Rescue Plan in March. As lawmakers begin to debate on how to best turn President Biden's proposed American Jobs and Families Plan into reality, we thank Senator Manchin for opening this important discussion today and for pursuing practical policies to finance critical public investments without adding to our national debt. Due to scheduling difficulties, Senator Manchin was unfortunately unable to join us live for this event, but we will play you his pre-recorded remarks right now.
Hello, I'm Senator Joe Manchin. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Reinvesting in American Infrastructure. I truly appreciate the work put in by the Center for Funding America's Future for their extensive research into corporate tax changes and more to fund infrastructure, R&D, and a host of other key investments. As I've said many times, if we expect to be able to attract new businesses and keep our existing businesses and communities healthy, that we must provide the basic services they need to operate. I thank you for the work that you've put into trying to find practical solutions to invest in infrastructure. I was proud to vote yes on the American Rescue Plan, which will provide West Virginians an unprecedented opportunity to jumpstart its economy and make investments in critical infrastructure projects with more than $4 billion in direct federal funding. The state of West Virginia will receive $1.25 billion, and West Virginia cities and counties will receive $677 million in direct relief funding. I fought hard to ensure states, counties, and cities will be able to use relief funding to make necessary investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Again, I appreciate today's panelists for making this forum possible. There is still much work to be done, and as all West Virginians know, we work best when we're working together. Thank you, and God bless each and every one of you.
All right, and now we turn to our panel. Bill Gale is the R.J. and Francis Miller Chair in Federal Economic Policy in the Economic Studies Program at the Brookings Institution, and he is co-director of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center. His research focuses on tax policy, fiscal policy, pensions, and savings behavior. He's also director of the Retirement Security Project, and he worked with me on the Bipartisan Policy Center's Commission on Retirement Security and Personal Savings a few years ago. Bill is the author of Fiscal Therapy, Curing America's Debt Addiction and Investing in the Future, which I highly recommend for those of you who have not read it. And prior to joining Brookings in 1992, he was an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a senior economist for the Council of Economic Advisors under President George H.W. Bush. Bill attended Duke University and the London School of Economics and received his PhD from Stanford University in 1987. Samantha Jacoby is a senior tax legal analyst with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities Federal Fiscal Policy Division. Prior to joining the center in 2018, she practiced law at two international law firms in New York and Washington, D.C. Previously, she worked as a policy and research analyst at the Solar Energy Industries Association, where she focused on the impact of tax incentives on the energy industry. She earned a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She holds an MPP in public finance from American University, also my alma mater, and a BA in political science from the University of the Incarnate Word. Thank you both for joining me. So President Biden has proposed to finance his infrastructure and family plans with several tax increases on businesses and high-income households. What do you like about the Biden package, and what, if anything, would you do differently? And whichever one of you wants to take it first.
I'll go first, unless you want to, Samantha.
Oh, that's great. Go ahead.
All right. So Biden's plan is what you get when you adhere to two things. First, you have a big spending program that you want to actually pay for rather than debt finance. And second, you want to avoid raising taxes on people with income below $400,000 per year. So it's a very progressive, very substantial package. I think there are three areas that I would highlight. The proposed changes in enforcement of the tax system and compliance in the tax system are historic, and I think would be truly a game changer. The corporate increases domestically, I think the main issue is raising the rate up to 28 as he has proposed. There's been some discussion that maybe it'll be 25 instead. In either case, it would be, half or a third of the cut that occurred in 2017. I think the really interesting corporate stuff happens on the international side, where first of all, the Biden administration accepts the framework that was established in 2017 rather than trying to undo it or move back to the old system. And then they try to tighten the framework substantially through the changes to GILTI and BEAT, and they want to get rid of FDII, which I think is also the right choice. So enforcement and corporate are two of the big features. The third is the individual side, where the treatment of capital gains, again, I think is potentially a historic change with taxing gains at death. Now there are a lot of qualifications to that we can talk about, but the notion of taxing capital gains at death, I think, is a fundamental change from what we've done before, and would definitely help control tax avoidance and allow us to tax capital gains at a higher rate. And lastly, I'll just point out what's missing from the plan or what's not in there. The most obvious thing to me there's no carbon tax proposal. The administration, I don't know if they've explicitly disavowed it, but there doesn't seem to be much hope for a carbon tax at this point. There's no adjustment to the estate tax. Of course, the exemption was raised dramatically in 2017. I think probably too far, but there's no adjustment for that. The 199A deduction stays in place as far as I can tell. And then looking at a bigger picture, there's no wealth tax, there's no value added tax. Now, those aren't necessarily meant as criticisms, just as statements of what's not in the tax. But I think basically you've got a very progressive package that yields a lot of revenues. It has, I think, a lot to be said for the various individual provisions, given what the goal is. It's definitely, in my view, a step forward in having a tax discussion and seeing what policymakers can come up with.
Okay, and what do you think, Samantha?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything Bill said. I think it's a very strong proposal overall. Just to kind of step back and give a little bit of context on the need to raise revenue, right? Federal revenues have declined to about 16.3% of GDP in 2019. That's below average, and particularly for kind of the high point in the business cycle. And it's not really enough to fund kind of the modern government that does the things we want it to do. So in that sense, it's like Bill said, it raises a lot of revenue. But it wouldn't even get us to kind of the recent high of 20% of revenue versus GDP that was in place in 2000. So it makes significant changes, raises a lot of revenue. But I think in a couple of ways, it's still kind of a relatively measured approach. It's not, this radical proposal that just raises lots and lots of revenue that is, too high. So on that point, a couple ways that, I sort of view it as a relatively measured approach. On the individual side, yes, it makes a big change to the way unrealized capital gains are taxed by, instead of allowing wealthy people to accumulate capital gains tax-free over a lifetime and then pass those gains to their heirs without ever paying income tax on it, taxes those gains at death. But it leaves a big benefit in place, and that's the ability to defer income tax over that lifetime, right? And there are kind of a couple of benefits of that, right? There's the time value of money benefit. Wealthy people are better off paying taxes, decades from now versus today. Wage earners can't do that. And then kind of their planning benefits, right? If you have a diverse portfolio, you're going to have capital gains and losses. You can choose when to realize your capital gains so that a loss can offset them. So there's still, just making the point, there's still big benefits to having that deferral in place, even with the end to tax-free stepped-up basis. The other thing I think, the IRS proposal is huge. It's really very welcome. Happy to see that. But that's almost half the revenue that is projected to be raised by the American Families Plan, and that's not new taxes, right? It's revenue that's already owed under current law. So I'm happy to talk in more detail about the IRS plan later on. And then on the corporate side, right, as Bill mentioned, it's rolling back about half of the corporate rate cut from the TCJA, still well below the 35% rate that was in place in 2017. And then this, on the international side, again, you're right, but like Bill said, keeping kind of the general structure in place, but tightening it. One part of that I'm really excited to see more detail on is the SHIELD proposal that would replace the BEAT. I think that's really exciting, and it acknowledges kind of the important historical moment that we're in with OECD negotiations. So that's pretty exciting to see. In terms of what I'd like to see added, Bill mentioned the estate tax, and I agree with that. The other one is, he mentioned 199 Cap A. I mean, that these are both things that the Biden campaign proposed to make changes to. The pass-through deduction, Biden proposed in the campaign to repeal it for those making more than $400,000 a year, and that would have raised around $160 billion within the budget window. The estate tax changes that Biden proposed would have raised something like $220 billion. So those would be other ways to raise significant amounts of revenue. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll ask some follow-up questions about some of those specific provisions you guys raised. But while I'm doing that, if anyone else, any of our attendees have any questions, they can feel free to ask it by using the webinar's Q&A function. So one thing that both of you guys mentioned was the step-up basis, and that being a productive change. President Biden's proposed to get rid of step-up basis, require people to pay taxes on unrealized capital gains above $1 million at death. But as you mentioned, that still leaves a pretty big hole. There's those first $1 million are still tax exempt, and once those gains pass to heirs, they don't pay any tax on the first 10, or I think now it's up to $24 million for $23 to $24 million for a couple. Do you think that we should be, or I guess you both said we should. So what kind of changes would you like to see to the estate tax? Should we be lowering the exemption thresholds, raising the rates, or is it time to talk about something more ambitious like an inheritance tax?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think, there's the kind of easiest thing to do would be to roll back the changes made in the TCJA. But the Biden campaign proposal would be more robust by going back to 2009 estate tax parameters, which instead of a 23.4 million exemption for a wealthy couple, there would be a 7 million exemption. So that's still not nothing. You can still pass $7 million to your heirs without paying estate tax. It would also have a 45% top rate. So yeah, I think that would be kind of a good way to start. There's also like plenty that can be done to cut down on some tax avoidance schemes, like ending grats, changing the valuation rules. Those are both things that the Obama administration proposed. Those would raise something like another 30 billion over 10 years. And then, yeah, I mean, I think an inheritance tax is certainly worth considering. I think it would do a lot, particularly just to kind of clarify that it's an income tax on heirs, right? So I think economically they're similar, but would kind of clarify that relationship between the heir and the income.
Bill?
The state tax is difficult to enforce well because of all the things that Samantha mentioned, the valuation rules and the trusts, and there's just a lot of ways to destroy value for estate tax purposes or shift it. And so with the proviso that all taxes look better on paper than they are in the real world, with that proviso, I like the idea of an inheritance tax, of shifting to an inheritance tax and treating the value received as income. And I understand the economic incidence would largely be the same, but the kind of the argument for the tax would change a bit, rather than being seen as a punishment for having accumulated a lot of wealth. It would be, the argument would be treating gifts as any other form of income, and taxing it under the income tax, with an annual exemption, with some averaging rules, so that people don't pay the top rate necessarily if the inheritance isn't that big. I would like to see policymakers pursue something like that. I think it would solve a lot of the both perceived and actual concerns with the estate tax.
Yeah, I think you both said that so well, that we right now, whenever there's conversation about the estate tax, we hear from Republicans that it's a death tax, and that really what we're talking about here is it's just reducing the disparity between how we are taxing income that you earn versus income that you inherit. And so I think what you both said makes a lot of sense there. Bill, one thing you mentioned was the historic nature of the capital gains tax that President Biden's proposed. I was looking back on it for historical comparison. I don't know that we've ever actually had a capital gains tax at the level President Biden has proposed. And I know there's been some discussion about does that go beyond the quote unquote revenue maximizing rate, or do the changes in step up basis make it so that we'll still get significant revenue from it. What are your general thoughts on, as the director of TPC, about what we're likely to see from some policy like that?
Well, I'll speak as an individual, not
Okay, fair
as
enough.
a PBC rep. Uh, uh, First thing, there are two separate things that have not been well separated in public discussion. There's ending basis step up at death, which is a policy all in itself. So if somebody buys an asset for $100, it's worth $1,000. They have a $900 capital gain. Then they die. The question is, does the heir inherit the asset at a basis of 1,000, which is what would be current law, or would they inherit it at a basis of 100, which is eliminating basis step up? There's a second issue of, once you've eliminated basis step up and you've recognized that there's a $900 capital gain, do you want to tax that at death, or do you want to pass the liability on that gain on to the heir and have the heir pay it when the heir sells the asset? Biden is proposing that in many cases, the $900 gets taxed at death. That is, death is treated as a constructive realization event. Now, there are a variety of exceptions to that in the proposal. There's $1 million exemption. There's a special treatment of farms and family businesses. There's special treatment of real estate. But the idea, I think, is not to get at the people that have $1 million in accrued capital gains, is to get at the people that have 100 million or $100 billion in capital gains, and not get the small businesses or family farms caught up in the activity. So that is a historic change if it were to happen. Importantly, if it were to happen, it were to close off one of the major channels for tax avoidance on capital gains. As Samantha mentioned, there's deferral. This would limit deferral, and it would limit deferral for the extremely wealthy who hold the vast majority of unrealized capital gains. And by doing so, by limiting that avoidance channel, you can then tax capital gains at a higher rate. The revenue maximizing rate will be higher because there are fewer avoidance channels. And so it makes sense logically, if you're going to raise the rate, to also try to close off the avoidance channels at the same time. And so, we can pick apart some of the details, but the basic idea of raising the rate and closing off the avoidance opportunities at the same time is not only consistent, it makes each of those items more powerful than they would be in the absence of the other one.
Samantha, what do you think of the capital gains proposal?
Yeah, I agree with Bill. I think there's been a lot of sort of hand wringing about the rate being too high. It would hurt investment, all of that. But there's not really any good evidence that capital gains rates affect economic growth or investment. And you have this major study from Danny Yeagan a few years back about the cut and the dividend rate from the top ordinary income rate down to 20%, and that he found that there was basically no impact on investment or the stock market. So I'm not so concerned about that, and I like Bill mentioned, right, and Bill's colleague Len Berman has written a lot about capital gains tax shelters, right? There's a whole industry basically trying to turn ordinary income into capital gains, and so in an important way, equalizing the rates would discourage some of this kind of uneconomic tax sheltering, which would be beneficial for the economy in that way, because you'd have investment in activities that are productive for economic reasons, not just for tax reasons.
Gotcha. And so I think one policy that Bill, you mentioned as not being in here is a national value added tax. I know that that's something Senator Manchin has mentioned in the past. I think if I recall correctly, he said something along the lines of infrastructure, something that everybody uses. And so maybe we have a tax that everybody pays in. As we're seeing sort of some of the Biden proposals get scaled back, like the 28% going to 25% or changes in how the global taxes will work. Do you think it is something that should be considered?
I think that we should have a value added tax at some point, but I can't see that it makes sense right now on either economic or political reasons. The political reasons I think are most salient. Samantha mentioned the extremely low level of revenues that we have right now. And if we're going to raise that, we're going to do it politically from the top down. So we need to get these tax increases for high income households in place first before we talk about a VAT. That's point one. Point two is with a VAT, it's critical to talk about how the money is used. The VAT itself is regressive and can impose significant burdens on low income households. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago that suggested coupling a VAT with a UBI, a universal basic income, that used up about, I think about a third of the revenues of the VAT, but in doing so insulated the bottom 60% of the population and in fact helped on net the bottom 40% of the population. And if we want to think about a VAT that finances healthcare or finances infrastructure or has a UBI, that can be a progressive policy, but a VAT that finances a corporate tax reduction is not a progressive policy. So that's point two. Point three is it's going to be hard with Biden's $400,000 pledge to institute a VAT. Now sorry, let me just finish. That may tell you more about the wisdom of the pledge than about the wisdom of a VAT, but nonetheless, the pledge has been made, and I expect the administration will try, more or less to adhere to it.
And so what do you think that implication is for something like a carbon tax, which I know you mentioned, I think Samantha may have mentioned it too. I know that carbon tax generally tends to be one of the economists' favored tools for climate change mitigation. Do you think that there is an argument for pursuing that here? Or I guess the question would be, if you said that was something you would like to see, even though it's not on the radar, why is that something you think is worth pursuing, even though it might also have that impact on below $400,000?
I mean, a carbon tax is practically literally the textbook solution to an externality in carbon emission. I think we should do it. I think the whole world should do it. There is, I think, a legitimate counter argument that if we do it and the rest of the world doesn't, we don't get, as much of the benefit as we would if the rest of the world did it too. But I still think, we could be a world leader and induce the rest of the world to do it. Regardless of my views, however, the administration has clearly put this either on the back burner or thrown it out altogether. It just does not seem to resonate with the White House, and they've pursued a strategy of subsidizing, clean energy or green energy rather than taxing carbon emissions.
And so if we're trying to look at revenue options, if we're seeing that some of the revenue options aren't going to, that we're going to get less than than was initially proposed, and we're looking for additional revenue sources. What are some that we could use that would be consistent with the administration's pledge? And I guess, Samantha, this is a good time to talk about 199A.
Yeah, you can do repeal of 199 Cap A above at AGIs above 400,000. You might phase it in over 400,000 so that there's not a cliff, something like that. But that would, like I said earlier, would raise somewhere around 160 billion over 10. It's scheduled to phase out at after, or not phase out, to end after 2025. So the revenue raising potential is kind of limited by that that scheduled ending of the deduction. But yeah, I mean, I think there is a really good case for repealing it. There's 50% of all business income is pass-through income, and kind of the argument for putting it in place in the first place was parity with corporations. But if you raise the corporate rate even to 25%, it's even more the game's even more tilted towards pass-throughs. That's the same with labor income, right? If you raise the rate on ordinary income to 39.6, and a pass-through owner can claim the deduction, and that their top rate would be around 35%, even with the 3.8% payroll tax or NIT, then that's almost 8 points lower than the rate that a top salary earner would make. So that encourages a lot of tax avoidance in gaming. If you can just set up a pass-through like an S corporation and have your employer pay you through your S corporation instead of getting a salary, that's a huge tax avoidance scheme. So yeah, I think 199 Cap A is a pretty clear option for that fits well within Biden's taxing wealth like work theme. So another one that you could maybe do above the $400,000 pledge. This is well, okay. So first, the other one that's a little easier is the 28% cap on itemized deductions. That was in Biden's campaign proposal, and I think it was 220 billion over 10, something like that. And then the other one is a little more kind of, hasn't been sort of vetted, in by JCT and all of this. It's a little newer. Is this proposal to tax stock buybacks like dividends? So that would raise a lot of money. It's a proposal by Daniel Hemmel and Greg Polsky, and it would raise a lot of money, principally from foreign shareholders, because foreign shareholders don't pay tax on don't pay U.S. tax on capital gains, but they do pay U.S. tax on dividends. So if you reform the treatment of the stock buyback, then you raise something like 70 to 80 billion per year. But that one, it's a little newer, I guess, in the public discourse.
Bill, any thoughts on those?
Sure. So I agree with everything Samantha just said. I just want to add 199A, the pass-through deduction, is incredibly regressive. If you look at the number, we're talking about more than half of the benefit going to people with income above $1 million. And it's just capping it at 400K would be a huge improvement. One thing that's not talked about that I just want to mention is the idea of what you might call a higher rate on extremely high income. So right now, somebody with $1 million pays the same marginal tax rate as somebody with 10 or $100 million, because of where the top bracket kicks in. And there's been some discussion of having a higher rate on, above $1 million or above 5 million. That is a place that could be considered. And then anything beyond that, involves creating new tax structures like a wealth tax or a mark-to-market capital gains, which I don't think we should do right now. I think we should try taxing it to death and see how that works. And then we can, if we want to continue the conversation about moving to tax it every year, that's another whole can of worms. But I think it's important to distinguish between proposals that basically take the existing tax structure and manipulate it, like capping 199A or adding a super top rate, versus proposals that require the setting up of an entirely new system of tax administration.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because I know that when we were putting together our PPI was putting together our budget blueprint a couple of years ago, we proposed something similar. I think it was on incomes over $10 million a year, we went up to 45 or 50%. And so it is interesting that we are talking about raising the top rate back to where it was under George W. Bush and President Obama, but not there hasn't been as much discussion of raising it further, and perhaps that is something that should be considered.
Let me just add, this is related exactly to the capital gains discussion and the point that Samantha made earlier about this whole industry that converts ordinary income into capital gains. There's pressure, if we do raise the top rate, that industry will be reactivated again unless we make adjustments in capital gains as well.
So as we turn to audience questions, I want to start with one that was submitted in advance by Jim Beal, who was a California state senator from 2012 to 2020 and chaired the state transportation committee. Jim says that when he was discussing the funding of their transportation legislation, the polling indicated that targeting repair, rehabilitation, and safety projects created a stronger public support for the gas tax and vehicle fees, and also that mandating increased oversight and efficiency was strongly supported. And so he asks, how important are these issues in the discussion, and would they help achieve stronger support? And I would tack on to that, one thing we've heard from across the aisle from Republicans is they have talked a lot about, proposing so-called user fees, whether that's, there hasn't been a lot of specificity about it, but maybe it seems like something like a vehicle miles traveled tax as a pay for that they could support. What are your thoughts on that sort of structure? And Samantha, let's start with you on that one.
I'll defer to Bill on this one.
All right, let's start with Bill on this one.
Okay, first of all, there's a famous paper by Ned Gramlich from, I think, the 1970s, maybe the early 80s, that shows that the return on investments in road repair, fixing potholes and stuff like that, are very high compared to the returns on other types of infrastructure investments, building new highways, building fancy train systems, whatever. And the problem is that politicians want to be able to cut ribbons, and so they always want to build these new systems rather than just fixing the potholes. No one goes on the local news and cuts a ribbon when a pothole is fixed. So it's interesting to hear that the California voters supported those type of policies. I mean, anyone who, you drive on a road and you hit a pothole and why can't they fix this? So I understand their interests, and I share them. I think the problem is the political system doesn't encourage those type of repairs. As for a vehicle miles traveled tax, people talk about that in terms of replacing a gas tax. We're going to have to move in that direction as electric cars don't use gas, and the gas tax has become an increasingly less useful metric of road use over time. So something like a vehicle miles travel tax would be in the right direction. I have to say I may get criticized for this. I don't view this as like the major issue in tax policy right now, but I think it's clear that we need to move. It's clear we need to move that way. But like if you ask me, even in environmental tax, what would be the most important thing? I would say let's get a carbon tax. But yes, this should be on the list, and if policymakers are willing to move on this, fine. But let's keep our eye on the big picture.
So I realize that this might be going in the opposite direction of that, but we're going to stick with the VMT because we have another question on the VMT, which is someone else asked, a 2019 CBO report found that a VMT could provide additional revenue and substitute for existing taxes on trucks that are credited to the Highway Trust Fund. And much of that is rooted in the fact that trucks have electronic logging devices in their cab already and impose greater damage to highways by virtue of their weight. So would it make sense to phase in a VMT that factors in weight for heavy duty trucks first as a sort of beginning step as a transition to a broader VMT?
Yeah, another famous article in Transportation Economics showed that the damage imposed by a vehicle was proportional to the fourth power of weight per axle. So yeah, trucks impose more damage, more than proportional to their weight. So I mean, given all the if we can run a GPS system, we can run a vehicle miles traveled system. So I think administratively it's possible. And again, it would be a good thing to do. But I worry if policymakers are spending all their time on this and not on capital gains and corporate tax and stuff like that.
And so jumping back sort of to the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about President Biden's proposals for increasing IRS enforcement. He's proposed, I think it's $80 billion in new enforcement funds over 10 years, and then also new reporting requirements. And they've projected this is going to raise $700 billion in revenue over the next 10 years. Can either of you talk about sort of why this is a historic investment that we need, because you both said we needed it? And do we think that $700 billion, that's a lot of money, do we think that we can get that just from better increasing the laws we already have? Well, Samantha, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So in terms of why it would be a historic investment, why it's needed, overall IRS funding is down by about 20% since 2010 in inflation adjusted terms. And that number is even higher when you just look at enforcement. And that has affected audit rates. Audit rates are way down. The number of revenue agents is down by 39%. So we're just not able to collect the revenue that is owed. The tax gap, Commissioner Rettig just said at a congressional hearing that the tax gap could be up to $1 trillion a year. So it's a huge amount of revenue that's not getting collected. And to kind of rebuild something as big of a loss as that requires major robust funding on a multi-year basis. You have to ramp up funding because the IRS can't use it all at once. They have to make long-term investments in technology, hire and train new audit staff. And it takes years to fully train an auditor. And while they're being trained, whoever's training them can't be doing audits, right? So it takes a long time to rebuild. And that's why this multi-year funding proposal is so important. And in terms of whether the $700 billion is realistic or not, I just want to point out, right, there's two, like you said, Ben, there's two pieces. There's the $80 billion in funding for enforcement and upgrading technology. And I think the Treasury understands that that money, the $80 billion for enforcement, will yield $240 billion in net revenue. And that is a reasonable estimate based on CBO estimates in the past and other estimates from outside analysts. And like I kind of alluded to, right, that number goes up over time because it takes a long time to use the money and to kind of ramp up the spending. So even outside the 10-year window, if that were to continue, right, like you could see even higher numbers. So I do think it's maybe even conservative. And then the other piece on information reporting they estimate that would yield 460 billion. So that's where the 700 total comes from. And information reporting, that is incredibly important, right? It recognizes that there's a link between the amount of information that the IRS has about taxpayer income and compliance. So wages and salaries have near perfect compliance rates, and that's because employers withhold and report the amount of income that their employees have. So it's like almost impossible for employees to underreport their income, right? But low visibility income like sole proprietors, other types of pass-through businesses, underreporting is much higher. So the aim here is to increase the amount of information that the IRS has about that low visibility income, and it does so in a pretty reasonable way that's not burdensome to taxpayers. As I understand it, would kind of create two new pieces of information on 1099s that banks already provide to the IRS and to taxpayers, and that's one for the amount of cash that's flowing into an account and the amount of cash that's flowing out of an account. So it's not perfect information because it doesn't exactly correlate with income, but you could imagine with the increase in funding for technology, the IRS kind of using artificial intelligence to kind of map a taxpayer's total bank accounts, inflows, outflows, and compare that to the amount of expenses they're claiming on their return, the amount of income that they're claiming, and say like, hey, there's a big discrepancy here, and then better target their audits. So I think the goal would be you're better targeting audits so that you're not auditing like really honest taxpayers so much, and with the same audit rate, you're kind of getting more revenue from that audit rate. And then the other way it raises income or raises revenue is if taxpayers know the IRS has the information, they're more likely to voluntarily report their income accurately. So yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how JCT CBO score something like this, but I do think it's pretty reasonable.
So let me just add to that. The tax evasion that the IRS estimates and sort of knows about, if you will, is about 3% of GDP. I mean, that's more than entire corporate tax revenues, right? There's an enormous amount of evasion. The evasion rate in sole proprietorships is over 50%. In farm income, it's really high. Some other forms of income, it's in double digits in a lot of non-wage income categories. In wage income, it's 1%. So there's an enormous amount of evasion. It's tilted toward capital income. And over the last 25 years, there's been this sort of backdoor attack on the tax system that has consisted of trying to starve the IRS. As Samantha mentioned, the number of agents, the number of audits, et cetera, are all down. And this bill seeks to change that. I want to emphasize, this proposal rather, seeks to change that. I want to emphasize something that Samantha said, which is the multi-year aspect of it. What we need in the IRS is investments in computer systems, in training, in personnel, and they need the kind of the security to know that if they buy the system this year, they'll be able to implement it next year. They'll have the funding to implement it next year. So the multi-year aspect of it is really important. The revenue estimate does not seem crazy to the 5 IRS commissioners who wrote in the Washington Post sometime this week. I get confused because you see it on the web before you see it in print. But that people should read that piece. And the potential for voluntary compliance to change, as Samantha mentioned, I think is a really important piece of the puzzle. I don't think that's scored in their revenue estimate. And those estimates, those changes could swamp the auditing, the revenue effects of auditing, or or just the evasion they catch via information reporting. So I think this is a huge step. Basically my reaction to this is it's about time. I don't know if this is the perfect set of items for tax administration, but it's definitely in the right ballpark. And if we're not doing this, what they propose, we should be doing something very similar to what they propose.
Okay, I think that all makes perfect sense. One last question I'll ask about, and this is something a little bit different. We've been talking a lot about the possible pay-fors for the infrastructure and jobs and family plans. But one tax change that we have seen a lot of congressional Democrats come out calling for is changes to the cap on state and local deductions. Some have gone as far as to say they won't be willing to vote for any tax increases, even on the top, unless we do something about the state and local, the cap on state and local tax deductions. What are your guys' thoughts on the so-called SALT cap?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. I think the SALT cap repeal would be very, very regressive. The Bill's group has all the numbers on that, but I don't think it should be part of the bill. If it is, then there's going to have to be some pay for. But even if you try to limit it in some way, either by raising the cap to some higher amount than 10,000, or doubling the amount for married couples, or something like that, or limiting it by AGI, there is it's still a significant cost. Yeah, that's kind of where I am on that.
I wish this issue would go away. I understand that people are annoyed at Trump and the Republicans for limiting it, but I don't think that reversing it is a good idea. My colleagues Len Berman and Tracy Gordon have a very interesting an interesting proposal to provide federal grants to states in lieu of increasing the deduction. That definitely deserves to be considered. But removing the cap, right, would be expensive and regressive. It would be antithetical to pretty much everything else that's in the Biden plan right now. It would muddle the message about being a progressive revenue raising package. And I understand why politicians like Schumer and Pelosi need to talk about this issue. They need to be able to go back to their constituents and say, look, we did everything we can, but we just couldn't get it in there. So I understand why they talk about it, but I hope that there is no serious consideration of raising the cap.
I think that it's interesting though. Well, two things. Number one, we actually just wrote a blog about proposals for automatic stabilizers, and one of the things we talk about is that proposal from your colleagues that I think is very good and makes sense as a better way to spend that revenue. So I would encourage people to check that out. The second thing is I think you raised a good point about the political origin of the SALT cap and how it has, because of how it was implemented, became such a big political issue. And I'm reminded of a conversation I had with one of my relatives who had been hit by the SALT cap and was very, very frustrated by it. And I asked why they thought it was such a big deal, because they're progressive and they want to see higher taxes on high income people. And what they said was that if the SALT cap had been capped to pay for scientific research or infrastructure or reduce the deficit, then they would be perfectly happy to have it. And what frustrated them was that the cap was put in place as a way of taxing folks like him in a blue state and using that to pay for tax cuts for people who are even richer, and and the significantly reduced corporate rate. And so I think that that in that context, if we are, as Samantha said, rather than taking pay-fors away from infrastructure and these priorities, that we do think people will be willing to pay the taxes for, that would be a mistaken redirection. So I think we're about to run out of time here, but any closing thoughts from either of you on any of the pay-fors we've discussed, anything we haven't discussed that you want to get in, or general advice to lawmakers going forward?
I just want to follow up on your friend's discussion that we talk about taxes a lot and where the money comes from a lot, but it's really essential to think about where the money goes. And I feel like the profession, the public policy profession, is a little bifurcated in terms of people who think about where the money comes from and people who think about where the money goes, but they're very related. And issues like using a VAT to pay for healthcare or UBI, or state and local deduction pay for R&D, those issues really resonate with people, and we should be talking about them more.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I mean, I think that this overall plan, considering the revenue raising and the spending, you put it all together, right? You're doing a lot of really good things with the money, right? You're reducing child poverty by 40%. You're putting investments in physical infrastructure that are long needed, and human capital, childcare, education, family leave, housing. So I think hopefully your friend would see all of that good and maybe be okay with the cap on the SALT deduction.
Yes, I'm pretty sure that that he is, and I would just I would hope that the lawmakers are considering that perspective as well, because I think that's an excellent point, that as long as we're using the money for something that people support, they'll be much more inclined to willing to pay for it. So I guess that's about our time. So thank you so much for joining us for this great conversation with Bill Gale and Samantha Jacoby. And thanks again to Senator Manchin for providing opening remarks. And we'll continue to have these kind of conversations as the American Jobs and American Families Plan work their way through Congress.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Bill. It's great to talk to you.
Yes, thank you very much.